afternoon, folks. It's Carter Seaton. I'm the host of Chapters here on Armstrong Television, and I'm coming to you from my back porch. Since we're all stuck at home, I thought it would be a good idea if we do something a little different. We can't do our regular interviews at Inner Geek, so we've invited some of our authors, some of who've appeared on our show actually, to give you recommendations for books that they think while you're sitting at home you might want to read. Our first this week is Kat Pleska. She is the author of a book called Riding on Comets. It's a memoir, and she's also the editor and publisher of Mountain State Press. And in addition to that, she teaches at the University of Charleston. Enjoy what she has to suggest.
Hello, everyone. I've been asked to come here today to talk to you about some books that might be good to read during this seclusion that we're all enjoying. My name is Kat Pleska. I'm an author and editor and teacher and storyteller. And I have 4 books that I'd like to recommend for any of you to read during this time. And the first one I want to talk about is Randi Ward's Whip Stitches. And it's a lovely little volume of poems, and each poem is a little compact expression of joy, of fear, of nature and the nature of humans and that sort of thing. And Randi is absolutely brilliant at these little compact poems, which might be good for you if you have trouble reading at length right now. It might be a good choice so that you can pick up and read a few poems and then do something else. But I want to read just a few of Randi's short little poems so that you can get a sense of what her poetry and her writing is like. The first one is called Permanent. If I just let her roll my head, she said I could be a pretty girl. And then a next one, After Berry Picking. Your purpled fingers braided broad blades of orchard grass into this crown that makes me wear my wilting brow high in the canning heat. And Frog. Even this wise frog has probably mistaken a ditch for a pond. And one more. Fawn. Planted in the tall timothy, your dappled hide took root and you dozed, trusting that she would return before the mower found you. Yeah, so it's a wonderful little volume. I highly recommend it. It's called Whip Stitches by Randi Ward. My next book is titled Appalachian North by Matthew Ferrence. And this is a memoir. And the value of this, besides the terrific writing in it, is that typically when we think of Appalachia, we think of maybe Pittsburgh South. Certainly the coalfield states, of which West Virginia, where I am, is entirely encompassed within Appalachia. I like to call it the heart of Appalachia. But mostly we think about the states like the western part of Virginia, eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, western part of North Carolina, and that sort of thing. But Matthew brings something to the scholarship and to the reading and to the awareness of many of us in Appalachia, and that there is an Appalachian North, because the Appalachian Mountains go up through Pennsylvania into New York and even up into Maine. And I read at one time that that chain actually continues on, goes underwater under the Atlantic and pops up in Wales. So maybe that's the reason there's a lot of similarity between particularly West Virginia and Wales. That's a possibility. But he has delightful chapters in here. Remember, this is a memoir, But he talks about how his where he's from in Appalachian North bumps up against the Rust Belt, and sometimes it's called Midwest. But this is what he has to say in the beginning of his little preface. I began this book with an idea based on casual observation that the functional realities of rural communities located along the entire chain of the ancient Appalachian Mountains carry certain similarities. In West Virginia, Pennsylvania, rural New England, and Atlantic Canada, places connected by the geology of the Appalachians, the people are thought of as poor and backward, as rural curiosities, and always as troubled. All along this ancient mountain chain, people have also struggled from a material lack of work, waning coal industries, timber industries, fisheries, and mills. Yet, from Pennsylvania northward, very few people actually see themselves as Appalachians. Despite the mountains and despite the reality that parts of Pennsylvania and New York do, in fact, lie within the zones officially designated as such. And so he's bringing you on to the reality of the entirety of Appalachia. And he says, this is a book without an argument at its core. Argument has been a problem with Appalachian books, in my view, and perhaps with all regional studies. So many writers and so many books seek to make a declaration. This is what a place is. Perhaps my discomfort with such certainty is born of my own roots in a place where regional identity exists as a blank. My home is sometimes called Appalachia, sometimes Rust Belt, other times the Midwest, even though very few who live there would accept any of those labels as correct. So it's very intriguing, and so I recommend that as good reading to add to your knowledge about Appalachia at this time. This third book is from a good friend of mine who's now passed away, Lee Maynard. Lee is well known for his Crumb trilogy and other books that he has written. And he's a wonderful, wonderful fiction writer. And this one, though, I particularly like, which is a little bit different from his others. It is titled as fiction by the Vandalia Press, which is an imprint of West Virginia University print. It's called The Pale Light of Sunset, Scattershots and Hallucinations in an Imagined Life. And Lee, of course, is one of those very visceral fiction writers. And what this collection is, because it's truly a collection, is a number of chapters that feel very memoir-like, although he would have probably smacked me up the side of the head for saying that, because he was very proud of his fiction work. And he insisted that, yes, he did use his life events for fiction, and he lived a life to kind of guarantee that he had plenty to write about, and he did. But when I interviewed him on West Virginia Public Radio back in 2009, when this book first came out, I asked him point blank, Lee, how much of this book is actually memoir, is actually truth? And he admitted that 50% of it was, real life. And that's probably true. He did love to fictionalize the events in his life. So a lot of this is based on the experiences he had. But this first chapter is titled The Parlor, 1936. Really makes me feel like, Lee, this one definitely is memoir. I am born in the parlor of my grandmother's house. I come screaming into the world among the only valuable things my grandmother owns. There is a small settee on which no one is allowed to sit, a tiny table of unknown origin, a pump organ which no one plays, a strange polka dot vase with a string of white glass going around it, doilies on everything, and me, pulled into the world by a midwife I would never know and would never meet again. I am born in West Virginia. I am a West Virginian. And as are all of us, I am a child only of West Virginia and nowhere of no one else. As I grow older and my mother brings me in from the mountains to visit my grandmother, I realize in my child mind that my grandmother's house is the only place in my mind, in my world, where I feel safe. I can smell the biscuits my grandmother makes, larger than any biscuits I have ever seen, larger than my hand. My grandmother feeds me biscuits and homemade jelly, and then I go back outside to play. Now, it's a lovely beginning to the first chapter, and it goes through chronologically from 1936 all the way up to pretty much 2005. It's where the journal ends, although he lived a good time past that. But we miss you, Lee. We miss your writing and what new writing we would have been able to experience. Okay, my fourth and final book is also a memoir. I guess you can tell I'm rather fond of memoirs. And the title of this one is Don't Tell Him You're Cold, a memoir of poverty and resilience. And this was written by Katherine Manley. Kathy Manley is a good friend of mine. I also happen to be her editor of this particular memoir. And I run the publishing company that she selected. And I was very proud and honored that she chose Mountain State Press to publish her memoir. Kathy grew up in mostly in southern West Virginia in coal camps, in abject poverty, often not having anything to eat and no resources to depend on, to count on. Her father was hurt when he was a teenager. He was a hobo. Please excuse my cat in the background. She's not supposed to be there, but you know, cats don't listen. Her father was hurt when he fell up under a train where he was traveling back and forth between West Virginia and Kentucky to do work when he was only 16 years old, and part of his leg was severed. And also at a later point, he was helping unload dynamite, and he was missing 3 fingers on one hand because a case blew up that he was handling, which is just horrific circumstances. But it was difficult for her whole family, her mother and her siblings, to survive. And her first chapter really brings that home when she starts to talk about how her father, who of course was disabled and couldn't search through the dumps to get a piece of wood that he needed for his peg leg. And so he would send Kathy, at only 5 or 6 years old, down into the dump to find a piece of wood that would work. And so if you could imagine what it was like for a small child to go into a dump and the horrid things that were found there. And they rode in an old panel truck, practically falling apart, which they lovingly titled the Blue Goose. The Blue Goose lurched around and through stacks of abandoned furniture, piles of broken toys, and bags of garbage. Daddy studied the raggedy sacks of logging timber, searching for a good slab of wood. After a bit, his eyebrows shot upward. He'd spotted something. He shut off Goose's motor. We got out and poked through the pile of wood, and I pulled out a long, narrow board and knocked off the sawdust. I held it up so he could see. He shook his head. Keep looking, Kathy. That's not wide enough. How about that one? I pointed to a rough piece of lumber that was wider than the first board, but not as tall as I was. I tried to lift it, but it was too heavy. Daddy picked it up and turned it around, examining it. No, it's a sycamore. See those knots running through? My saw can't cut through them. I turned when Daddy grunted. He'd found a piece about 4 feet long and a foot wide. He pulled it closer with one of his crutches, studied it, and picked it up. And then I'll move over to another area where she's talking about looking for a tire, which he used the rubber to cushion the bottom of and give him grip on the bottom of his peg leg. And so she says, still, I made my way down the garbage pile. I kept my eyes open for special treasure, a doll maybe, or a jump rope, something I could keep and play with. anything. Finally, I reached the tires. I turned over 2 or 3, but they had large gashes. One had a nest of some sort in it, and another had huge water bugs climbing in and out. I kept looking until I spotted one lying under an old kitchen cabinet. I think I found one, I yelled to Daddy. Check it good, he said. Make sure it's not worn. I inspected the tire. Looks pretty good to me. Want me to bring it up? If you can, he said. I slipped my hands inside the rim of the tire and tugged, but the wooden cabinet pinned it to the ground. I sat down, dug in my heels, gripped the tire, and pulled. It didn't budge. I kicked the stupid cabinet. Determined, I stood, dusted off my grimy hands, and leaned every ounce of my 40-something pounds into the cabinet, pushing and shoving until it finally gave in and rolled away. My back felt stiff when I straightened, and I turned to look up the hill, checking for the best path to climb with the tire. Daddy pointed out what appeared to be the easiest route. He stood at the top and instructed me as I dragged the tire past rusty pipes, broken glass, and empty paint buckets. I'd push for a while, and I'd pull for a while. Finally, that tire and I made it to the top. Daddy bent and looked at it. You done good. He patted my shoulder. Let's get it loaded. I rolled it into the back of the truck and helped him throw it in. So, as dire as the circumstances are when Kathy's growing up, it as you read through it, you realize that this is one determined little girl, and she does eventually sit down and realize to herself, I may be poor now, but I am not going to be poor when I grow up. And then this is the story, this is the journey of her moving toward self-reliance and being able to pull herself out of society's poverty, and becoming a very successful, award-winning teacher for decades. So it's a story that people say it makes them cry, it makes them laugh, because she has a tremendous sense of humor in this, and it gives you hope. So I highly recommend Don't Tell Them You're Cold, a memoir of poverty and resilience by Katherine Manley. So here, that is just 4 books that maybe you want to tackle and to read during our time of reading in COVID-19. So I hope you enjoy, and thank you for joining us. Bye.
Our second author is Jeff Mann. His books cover several genres. He's written 6 novels, several novellas, and a whole bunch of collections of poetry. He is a teacher of creative writing at Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech. So we'd like to hear what he has to say. He's got a couple of books that he recommends. So take a listen.
My name is Jeff Mann, and I want to talk to y'all about a piece of Appalachian writing that I'm very fond of. I co-edited this book, LGBT Fiction Q, Fiction and Poetry from Appalachia, with Julia Watts. And I started to read her novels, and I discovered that they were, all of them, really moving and really funny, and generally would bring me to tears by the end of the novel. So I want to talk to you about Phases of the Moon, which is Julia's second novel. I'll give you just the little description in the back, and then I just want to read you a scene that I really enjoy. So this is published, it was originally published by Naiad Books, which was a lesbian press in Tallahassee that has since been turned into Bella Books, still in Tallahassee. The description: growing up dirt poor in a Kentucky coal mining camp in the 1940s has made Glenda Mooney hungry for everything that life has to offer. She discovers early on the 2 vital forces that will sustain her throughout her life: music in the sweet harmonies of gospel and bluegrass, and love in the arms of a preacher's daughter. This ill-fated romance and the resultant broken heart increases Glenda's devotion to music, and armed with just raw talent and wide-eyed wonder, the young singer sets out to conquer the world. It reminds me a lot of some of Lee Smith's work, Fair and Tender Ladies in particular. So it's a lesbian romance, and it's a look at country music and rock and roll. And there's a scene that I feel compelled to read simply because I grew up in Appalachia as a gay guy, and there were a lot of fundamentalist Christians that made the world feel hostile to me, and I have a deep dislike for those sorts of people. So I think you'll probably figure out why this scene appeals to me. The character Glenda is about to be baptized, and the preacher has discovered something about her previous to this baptism that causes him to be especially malicious. Luckily, she has two brothers, Roy and Vaughn, who are watching this scene. Brother Dixon grabbed me by the wrist and yanked me waist deep into the muddy water. His hand was cold and bony, and he was squeezing my wrist so hard I thought he would break it. Please, Jesus, I prayed. Please, Jesus, just a quick dip in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I'll never kiss a girl again. Brother Dixon squeezed my wrist tighter, which I didn't even think was possible. And I looked up at him. His face was hot pink, and the veins in his forehead were bulging out. We have before us a sinner, he boomed. Everybody looked real surprised, especially my mama, who was probably wondering what I did wrong besides talk too much. A sinner in the eyes of God, Brother Dixon went on, a sinner in the eyes of this whole church. He grabbed me by the shoulders and bored into me with those coal black eyes. But you were lucky, Glenda Mooney, lucky because you now stand before Jesus Christ, who has the strength and the power, yes, the power, to wash away the blackest of sins and make your nasty, stinking soul pure again. He didn't dunk me so much as tackle me. The first thing I knew, his weight was on me, my head was under, and brown water filled up my eyes and nose and mouth. I knew I had to do something fast, so I grabbed onto his hand, twisted my head around, and bit him as hard as I could. He snatched his hand away, and I managed to get my head above water long enough to hear old man Cooper shout, "Praise the Lord! That demon's done left her body and gone into his'n." I was too busy coughing and sputtering to move fast, and Brother Dixon managed to grab a hold of my arm, shouting, "Don't you think you're pure yet, missy?" Just then I heard two splashes as Vaughn and Roy jumped into the water. Roy broke in between Brother Dixon and me like we were playing a game of Red Rover. Vaughn helped me out of the water while Roy slugged Brother Dixon so hard in the jaw that he fell sprawling back into the river. As soon as I hit shore, I fell to my knees and vomited mud. That was the last day my family had any part of the Argonne Missionary Baptist Church. Mom and Daddy wrote my almost fatal baptism off to the fact that Brother Dixon wasn't from around here. But Roy and Vaughn agreed with me that it was really because the good Reverend was just as crazy as a best bug. Even as an adult, though, Roy remembers the day of my baptism with a crooked mouth grin. "It was a dream come true for me, sissy," he said to me one time. "I'd always wanted to bust a preacher one in the chops." Me too. Thank you. That's a lot of fun. Let's see if I can figure out how to stop this.
So that should give you plenty of reading suggestions for this week at least, and we'll be back to see you again on another chapters episode with 4 authors who have more suggestions to give you about what you might do while you're staying home. So stay home, stay well, and happy reading. Bye.
Connect with Chapters via email. Write to lp4@zoom.email. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, and follow. All chapter episodes are available on YouTube. Visit Armstrong's YouTube channel, follow Armstrong, and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.